I have seen my brother face down a charging bull, a furious creditor, and a French dueling pistol without so much as a blink. But I had never before seen him stand in the doorway of his own carriage, holding a lantern aloft, utterly speechless. That alone should tell you what sort of night it was at the Ram and Crown, and why I have never, in the years since, let him forget it. We had stopped at the inn only because a wheel wanted greasing and the horses wanted rest, Edmund having driven us at his usual punishing clip since dawn. My brother does not travel to arrive anywhere in particular. He travels because Kelsmore, our father's house, our house now, sits empty and quiet and full of rooms he cannot walk through without his jaw going tight, and so he keeps himself elsewhere, always elsewhere, and I keep myself with him because someone in this family ought to make certain he eats a proper supper now and again. The servants at the London house call him the Restless Duke, not to his face, but I have heard it, and it is not unkind. It is only true. The Ram and Crown was heaving that evening, 3 coaches in the yard at once and ostlers shouting over each other, and the innkeeper, a round, sweating, well-meaning fool named Hobbs, was trying to manage it all with a ledger and a stub of pencil and not quite enough sense for the task. It was into this chaos that a young woman arrived on foot from the mail coach stop, carrying 1 bandbox and looking as though she had not slept properly in a week, which, as I would later learn, she very nearly had not. "Braddock," she said to Hobbs, breathless. "I booked passage under the name Braddock on the Bristol Mail. I was told to leave my trunk here and it would be loaded." "Braddock, Braddock," Hobbs ran his thumb down a smudged page. "Ah, here we are." "Trunk's already gone up, miss. Sent on ahead with the coach in the yard there, on account of the crowding. We've had to load early where we could." "Thank you," she said, with the particular relief of a woman who has spent a long day being thanked by no one and thanking everyone. And she went, as directed, toward the yard, where a fine dark traveling coach stood waiting with its door open and its steps down, because a Braddock family did indeed have a coach in that yard that night, the trouble being that it was not hers. It was the Duke of Kelsmore's second coach, sent ahead from the last posting house under the family name my brother uses when he does not wish to be recognized on the road, which is, in point of fact, Braddock, an old family name, his mother's, worn like a disguise so that innkeepers do not fall over themselves and charge him double. I did not see any of this happen. I have only ever had it from her, told afterward with a dry twist to her mouth that made the whole disaster sound almost sensible, which I think is the particular genius of her character, that she can make chaos sound like a reasonable Tuesday. What I do know is this. She climbed into that coach believing it hers, sat down upon velvet cushions finer than any mail coach could boast, and within a quarter hour, worn through by days of travel between one bad post and the promise of a worse one, fell fast asleep with her cloak drawn round her and her bonnet fallen back against the seat. My brother returned to his coach some 2 hours later, having gone in search of Hobbs about the wheel, cross and tired, and wanting nothing more than his flask and his own silence, and found instead a stranger asleep in his private carriage, breathing softly, one hand curled loose in her lap like a child's, though I promise you there was nothing childish in the set of her chin even in sleep. He did not shout. I want that understood, because it would have been easy for him to shout, and easier still for the yard full of gossiping travelers to make a scandal of a lady discovered alone in a duke's coach after dark. And scandal was precisely what he could not afford, not with 3 other coach parties watching the Ram and Crown's yard with the avid, hungry boredom of people who have been waiting too long for fresh horses. I came round the corner of the stable just as he lifted the lantern higher, and I saw his face, my brother's face, which I have watched compose itself into granite indifference at funerals, at his own father's deathbed, at the reading of a will that gave him everything and no comfort in it whatsoever, go, for one unguarded moment, entirely undone. Surprised, not affronted. Not even angry, not truly, though he would tell you otherwise if you asked him now. "Madam," he said low, "You are asleep in my carriage." She woke the way sensible people wake, which is to say not all at once and not in a fright, but with a slow gathering of her wits before she opened her eyes fully. And when she did open them, she looked at him, at this large, dark, immaculately dressed stranger holding a lantern over her like some grim household god, and did not scream, did not faint, did not do any of the things a lesser sort of woman might have done for effect. She sat up, smoothed her skirts, and said, with as much composure as a woman can muster who has just woken in a nobleman's carriage by mistake, "I do beg your pardon. I believe there has been an error." "There has indeed," he said. "Is this not the Bristol coach?" "It is not." "Then I have made a very great mistake," she said, "and I am sorry for it, though I confess I am more sorry to have lost the sleep than the dignity, as I had precious little of the first and can spare rather more of the second." I heard that. I was close enough to hear it, and I very nearly laughed aloud in the middle of the yard, because I do not believe anyone has spoken to my brother in quite that manner since our mother died. He stood there with his lantern and his face working through several forms of astonishment, and behind him, not 10 feet distant, I saw 2 women from the party bound for Bath lean their heads together, and a gentleman from the Bristol coach raise his eyebrows in a way that promised gossip by breakfast. That was the moment, I think, that decided him. Not her composure, though I believe that struck him more than he let on even to me. It was the sight of those raised eyebrows, the certainty that within the hour there would be a tale traveling the length of the Bath Road about a duke and a strange woman and his private carriage, a tale that would grow uglier with every retelling, until it had ruined a perfectly blameless governess, and handed him, besides, a scandal he had spent his whole adult life avoiding. My brother has many faults. I could list them for you at length, being his brother and therefore entitled. But he has never in his life allowed an innocent party to be crushed under a weight he could shoulder instead, and he did not intend to start with a sleeping stranger who had done nothing more than trust an innkeeper's ledger. He turned, and I watched him decide something, the way I have watched him decide to buy a failing tenant farm or to sit up all night with a sick horse rather than send for the groom. "Edmund," he said to me, for he had seen me by then, of course he had, "fetch Hobbs, and find Mrs. Tallow." Mrs. Tallow was our old nurse's sister, a widow of excellent sense who traveled with our household for exactly such purposes as chaperoning, though she had been meant to join us only at the London end of the journey. That my brother thought of her at all, in the space of a single startled minute, tells you something of the quality of mind under all that granite. "I don't know that woman," I said, mostly to see what he'd say. "You don't need to know her. You need to fetch Hobbs and stop grinning like that. It does not become you." I fetched Hobbs. I will confess I was grinning the entire way. What followed, out in that yard, under lantern light with half the coaching parties of the Bath Road pretending not to watch, was the most correct, most carefully managed piece of theater I have ever witnessed my brother perform, and I have watched him address the House of Lords. He explained, in a voice pitched to carry to exactly the people who needed to hear it and no further, that there had been a clerical error at the desk. Hobbs, sweating, corroborated this with more enthusiasm than accuracy, involving a shared name on the ledger, and that the lady, a governess traveling to a new post, had been innocently misdirected to the wrong coach by a porter's mistake. He said it the way a man reads out a fact already settled, brooking no debate, and something about the flat certainty of a duke's voice saying a thing was so tends to make it so, at least in the minds of strangers glad of a tidy explanation. Then, because a tidy explanation was not quite enough to prevent tongues wagging about a lady alone in a duke's coach at any hour, mistake or not, he did the thing that turned the whole business from potential scandal into something almost gallant. He announced, for the yard's benefit, that as the lady's own conveyance had already gone on without her, which was true, the Bristol mail having departed 20 minutes before, carrying, I imagine, some bewildered soul sitting atop the wrong trunk. He could hardly leave a gentlewoman stranded at a coaching inn at night, and that she would travel on with his party, under Mrs. Tallow's chaperonage, until such a point as proper arrangements could be made to see her safely to her situation. It was, in its way, a small masterpiece of a lie that was almost entirely true. Nothing improper had happened. Nothing improper would happen. And by declaring it so, loudly, correctly, with a widow produced within the half-hour to lend it all starch, he made it very much harder for anyone to whisper otherwise. I watched the governess through all of this. She did not simper, did not weep with gratitude, did not do a single thing I might have expected of a woman rescued from ruin by a duke. She listened to him lay out the plan with her chin level and her eyes assessing, and when he finished she said, "That is very good of you, Your Grace, though I notice you have arranged the whole of my next 4 days without once asking whether I have an objection." The yard went very quiet around us. Hobbs looked as though he might expire on the spot. My brother's mouth did something I had not seen it do in a long while. It almost smiled. "Have you an objection?" "None that outweighs a night on the road with no coach and no coin for another inn," she said. "But I should like it noted that I am agreeing to your plan, not receiving it as a rescue. I am not so poor a creature as that." "Noted," he said, and something passed between them just then, quick as a struck match, that I did not understand until days later, though I suspect she and I both understood it a good deal sooner than he did. Her name, we learned within the hour, was Miss Alice Farrow, and she was indeed a governess, presently between posts, traveling to take up a position with a family in Bristol, whose last governess had left rather suddenly, for reasons Miss Farrow did not elaborate on and which I did not, at the time, think to ask about. She had, she told Mrs. Tallow over a hasty supper arranged in a private parlor, spent the better part of 6 years moving from household to household, valued for her competence and dismissed the moment her employer's circumstances changed, or their children grew, or their tempers soured, always with perfect civility and never once with any regard for what became of her afterward. "They speak to you," she said, not bitterly, only plainly, the way a woman states a fact she has long since stopped expecting anyone to argue with, as though you were a very useful piece of furniture. "Wind the clock, mind the children, do not trouble us with your opinions. I have grown rather good at not having any opinions in front of employers. It is restful in its way." "And yet you had one for my brother, not 10 minutes after waking in his carriage," I said, because I could not resist it. "Your brother is not my employer," she said, and there was that dry twist to her mouth again, and I began to understand, watching my brother watch her say it, that this was going to be a very interesting 4 days indeed. That first night, arrangements were made with a speed that would have done credit to a general on campaign. Mrs. Tallow, roused from her own room at the inn with barely a word of complaint, agreed at once to chaperone Miss Farrow the remainder of the journey, declaring the whole affair a great deal more interesting than my sister's correspondence, which is all I had to look forward to otherwise. Rooms were arranged. The lady's actual trunk, it emerged after some further inquiry of poor sweating Hobbs, had gone on the Bristol coach after all, correctly loaded, while it was only Miss Farrow herself who had wandered, through no fault of her own, into the wrong conveyance, a detail that struck me, and I think struck my brother too, as rather perfectly emblematic of a woman who had spent 6 years being sent in whatever direction her employers pointed without anyone troubling to ask if it suited her. I did not sleep much that night. I lay in my narrow in bed listening to the yard settle, the last carriage wheels creak away, the ostlers banking down for the night, and I thought about the look on my brother's face when he'd lifted that lantern. I have shared a nursery, a schoolroom, and half a lifetime of holidays with Marcus. That is his given name, though I do not use it above twice a year, as he prefers Kelsmore or nothing at all, a habit I attribute to our father, who never let either of us forget which of us would carry the title. I know his face in all its usual configurations, bored, irritated, carefully blank, more rarely and more preciously amused. I did not know the face he had worn looking down at a sleeping stranger, and I lay awake turning it over like a coin I could not quite place the value of. We set out at first light. My brother travels the way other men attack a siege, all discipline and no patience for delay, and so we were on the road again before the innkeeper's yard had properly woken. 4 of us now crowded into the 2 coaches, Mrs. Tallow and Miss Farrow in the second with the boxes, myself riding sometimes with my brother and sometimes, out of curiosity, I will not entirely deny, with the ladies. It was on the second morning, some hours out from the last posting house, that I first saw the 2 of them speak at length, for my brother had ridden ahead a stretch on his own horse to clear his head, as was his habit, and came back to find the second coach halted at a crossroads while a wheel was checked, and Miss Farrow standing outside it, stretching her back with the unself-conscious relief of a woman who has spent 4 hours folded into a coach seat. "You ought to sit," he said, dismounting. "The ground is damp." "I have been sitting for 4 hours, Your Grace. My back has opinions of its own, and just now they outrank yours." I saw him fight a smile and lose. "You are the first person in some years to tell me my opinions have been outranked. I imagine most people are too frightened of you to say so. And you are not frightened of me. I have managed 4 different sets of employers, 2 of them titled, one of them a bishop's wife who believed Latin declensions were a moral failing in young girls. I have very little fear left over for a duke who was kind enough not to have me arrested for falling asleep in his coach. You make it sound as though I did you a great favor." "You did," she said simply, and something in her voice shifted, lost its brightness for just a moment, "though I suspect you did it as much to save yourself a scandal as to save me one. I do not mind. A kindness needn't be pure to be useful." He looked at her for a long moment, and I busied myself with my horse's girth strap, feeling rather like an intruder upon something, though we stood in the open middle of a public road with a wheelwright hammering not 10 feet away. "That is an ungenerous reading of my character," my brother said finally. "Is it inaccurate?" He did not answer that directly, which told me, more than any answer could have, that it was not entirely inaccurate, and I think it told her the same, for she nodded once, as though a point had been settled, and turned back to help Mrs. Tallow with a dropped shawl, and the moment closed over as neatly as water over a dropped stone. "I want to tell you plainly, because I think it matters to the sort of story this is, that Miss Farrow never once used her circumstance to angle for more than was offered. She did not flutter, did not contrive further meetings, did not once trade upon the strangeness of her situation to secure herself advantage with a duke who could have settled her whole future with a word. She corrected him when she thought him wrong, thanked him when he was kind, and otherwise conducted herself exactly as a sensible woman conducts herself when thrown, through no design of her own, into 4 days of proximity with a man she had never intended to meet. It was, I came to think, the very ordinariness of her dignity that undid him. He had spent a decade surrounded by young women who performed helplessness for his benefit, hoping he would notice and rescue them into a title. Miss Farrow did not perform anything. She simply was who she was, tired and clever and a little worn at the edges from being overlooked, and it seemed to unsettle my brother more than any calculated charm could have managed. That second night we stopped at a smaller inn than the Ram and Crown, a quieter place with a low common room and a fire that smoked more than it warmed. And it was there, over a supper of indifferent mutton, that I first heard Miss Farrow speak of her family, prompted by Mrs. Tallow's gentle inquiries. "My father was a curate," she said, "a good man and a poor one, which I have found is rather often the case with good men. He taught me Latin and Greek because he had no son to teach it to and could not bear to waste the knowledge, and when he died I found myself 21, with an education fit for a scholar and an income fit for nothing at all. Governessing was the obvious answer. I am good at it." I do not say that with false modesty, Your Grace. I am genuinely good at it, and it has bought me precisely no security whatsoever, because a governess's worth lasts only as long as her employer's patience or her charge's need of her, whichever expires first. That seems a hard bargain, my brother said. It is the only bargain on offer to women of my situation. I do not resent it. I only observe it. She looked up at him then, quite directly, in that way she had of meeting his eyes without any of the flinching deference the rest of the world offered him. You, I think, have never once in your life had to make a bargain you did not like the terms of. You would be surprised, he said, and something closed in his face, a shudder coming down, and I saw her notice it, saw her file it away rather than push at it, which I thought then and think now was its own kind of wisdom. I ought to say something here of my brother's own history, since I have been circling it, and since I think it explains why a man who avoided marriageable young women the way other men avoid the smallpox found himself, 4 days into an accidental journey, unable to look away from a governess with ink-stained fingers and a sharp tongue. Our father arranged Marcus's first engagement when my brother was 23, to a young woman of excellent family and colder heart, who spent 2 years extracting every advantage the match could offer: settlements, jewels, a house in town refurbished at Kelsmore expense, before jilting him a month before the wedding for a wealthier prospect recently returned from India. Our father, rather than comforting his son, berated him for the public humiliation of it, as though Marcus had somehow arranged his own betrayal for the pleasure of embarrassing the family name. My brother has not properly trusted his own judgment about a woman since, and has certainly never again allowed himself to be managed, courted, or angled for. He travels, I have come to believe, not merely from restlessness of spirit, but because Kelsmore itself is full of rooms where that engagement was celebrated, where wedding clothes were fitted, where our father's disappointment still seems to hang in the air like old smoke. Miss Farrow knew none of this yet, but I think she sensed the shape of the wound even without the details, the way a careful physician can sometimes feel a break beneath unbroken skin, and she did not press, and I believe that restraint bought her more of my brother's regard than any amount of clever conversation could have. On the 3rd day it rained, a hard, steady rain that turned the road to soup and slowed us to a crawl, and by mid-afternoon my brother called a halt at a wayside inn far humbler than either of our previous stops, more alehouse than establishment, with a single overworked girl serving and a taproom full of drovers waiting out the weather. There was no private parlor to be had. We took what was offered, a corner table near the fire, and it was there, crowded together out of necessity rather than choice, that I watched something shift decisively between my brother and Miss Farrow. A child began crying somewhere in the back of the inn, a thin, exhausted, hiccuping sort of crying that goes on because the child crying it has simply run out of any other way to express its unhappiness, and I watched Miss Farrow's head turn toward the sound the way a compass turns north, unbidden and immediate. "Someone ought to see to that," she murmured, half to herself, and a moment later, without any fuss or announcement, she had risen and gone to find the source of it, and returned some 10 minutes later with a small, red-faced girl of perhaps 4 years balanced on her hip, the child's mother, a drover's wife, travel-worn and near tears herself with exhaustion, trailing gratefully behind. "She is only overtired," Miss Farrow said, settling the child onto her own lap with the unthinking competence of long practice, "and hungry, and cross about both, which is a very reasonable thing to be cross about." She produced, from some pocket of her cloak, a heel of bread saved from her own dinner, and broke it into small pieces, and within a quarter hour had the child not merely quiet but drowsing against her shoulder, thumb in mouth, while the mother sat across from us weeping quiet tears of relief and gratitude. I watched my brother watch this. I have rarely seen a man look so thoroughly undone by so small a domestic scene. He had, I think, imagined governesses in the abstract, as a category of useful person one hired and forgot, the way one hires a coachman or a cook. He had not imagined the particular tenderness of competence, the way a woman who has spent 6 years being overlooked by the grown members of every household she served might nonetheless bend, without thought of audience or advantage, toward a stranger's exhausted child. "You are very good with her," he said, when the mother had gone to settle her own supper, and the child slept on boneless against Miss Farrow's shoulder. "I have had a great deal of practice being good with other people's children," Miss Farrow said, and there was something in her voice just then, some old ache surfacing briefly before she smoothed it away, and rather less practice being asked whether I might like children of my own one day. Employers do not generally think to ask a governess what she wants. It is assumed the wanting was left behind, with whatever circumstance made her a governess in the first place. "And is it left behind?" She looked at him for a long moment, the firelight catching the tired lines at the corners of her eyes, the strength in the set of her shoulders even now, holding a stranger's sleeping child. "No," she said, "I do not think it is left behind at all. I think it is only put away very carefully, in case I should ever have use for it again." I do not believe my brother said anything further for some minutes. I do not believe he trusted himself to. We reached a proper posting town by the 4th evening, weather clearing, roads drying, and it was there that the business of Miss Farrow's onward journey to Bristol had to be settled in earnest, for we were near enough now that the roads diverged, our party bound for London, hers for the family that awaited her 30 miles further on. I remember that evening with more clarity than almost any other of my life, because I spent the better part of it pretending to read a 3-day-old newspaper in the corner of an inn parlor, while my brother and Miss Farrow conducted, not 6 feet away, the sort of conversation that changes the whole shape of two people's futures without either of them quite admitting that is what they are doing. "You will reach Bristol tomorrow," my brother said, "if the roads hold." "I will." "And take up your post with the Ashworth family, I believe you said." "The Ashworths, yes. 2 daughters, I am told, and a mother who writes a very correct letter and says nothing at all about her actual disposition, which experience has taught me to regard as an ill omen." "You do not sound as though you are looking forward to it." "I am looking forward to it precisely as much as I have looked forward to every post these 6 years, she said. "Which is to say, I am grateful for the wage and braced for the disappointment. It has been my experience that hope is a luxury I cannot generally afford in matters of employment." My brother was quiet a moment. Then he said, in a voice I had not heard him use in some years, careful and low and entirely without his usual armor of authority, "I find I do not much like the notion of your going to a house that has earned only your bracing and none of your hope." "It is very kind of you to say so. It changes nothing about the arrangement, however. I have an engagement to honor and no fortune to refuse it with." "What if there were an alternative arrangement?" I lowered my newspaper perhaps 2 inches, unable to help myself. Miss Farrow went very still. "I do not think I take your meaning, Your Grace." "I think you take it perfectly well, and are declining to make this easy for me, which I confess I find I admire rather more than I ought to." "You have known me 4 days." "I have known you 4 days during which you fell asleep in my carriage, corrected my manners in front of half the coaching inns of the Bath Road, told me plainly that my kindnesses are not always pure, and then held a stranger's screaming child until she slept, all without once asking me for a single thing beyond fair treatment. I have known duchesses of 30 years' acquaintance I could not say as much for." "That is a very handsome speech," she said, and her voice was not quite steady, "but a duke does not marry a curate's daughter turned governess on 4 days' road acquaintance, whatever handsome speeches he makes at wayside inns. There will be talk enough already about the coach. I will not have it said I engineered the rest of it, that I contrived a mishap to trap a title." No one who has spent an hour in your company could believe you capable of contriving anything so tedious as a trap, my brother said. You have spent this entire journey trying to talk yourself out of my good opinion rather than into it, which is, I think, the single strangest campaign for a duke's hand I have ever encountered, and also the only one I have ever found convincing. I confess I put the newspaper down entirely at that point. I am not conducting a campaign, Miss Farrow said, color rising in her cheeks. I am telling you the truth, which is that I have spent 6 years being moved about like a piece of furniture by people who never once consulted my preference, and I find I have grown rather attached to the idea that the next arrangement of my life, whatever it is, should be one I chose, and not one that was decided for me over my head in a coaching yard by a duke who felt sorry for me. There it was, I thought, the heart of it laid out plain as a hand of cards on the table. She was not refusing him. She was refusing to be handled, refusing to be swept from one arrangement into another without her own voice in the matter, however grand the alternative on offer, and I watched my brother absorb this, watched something in his face that I can only describe as respect deepen into something considerably warmer. Then I will not decide it for you, he said. I will ask you, and you may refuse me as freely as you have corrected me these 4 days past, and I promise you I will survive it, though I do not think I shall enjoy it. Miss Farrow, Alice, I do not offer this out of pity, and I think you know it, or you would not be arguing with me so fiercely about my motives rather than simply declining outright. I offer it because I have spent 4 days in the company of the only person who has looked at me in a decade, without either fear or calculation in her eyes, and I find I am not eager to return to a life in which no one does either. The taproom around us seemed, for just a moment, to hold its breath, though in truth it was only Mrs. Tallow, folding her needlework with elaborate unconcern some few feet distant, and myself, forgetting entirely to pretend at my newspaper. Miss Farrow did not answer at once. I will give her that credit above all else, that she did not fling herself at the offer the way any number of women of my acquaintance would have done, title or no title, feeling or no feeling. She sat with it, turning it over the way she had turned over every decision of that strange journey, weighing it against 6 years of hard-won caution. If I say yes, she said finally, I want it understood between us now, before witnesses, that I am not a rescued creature grateful for her deliverance. I have managed my own life since I was 21 with no help from anyone, and I will go on managing my share of whatever life we make together. I will not be moved about your houses like a piece of good furniture, however finely you dress the moving of it. I would not have you any other way, my brother said, and I think, had you offered to be otherwise, I should have withdrawn the offer on the spot, out of sheer disappointment. Then, Your Grace, Miss Farrow said, and I saw the corner of her mouth curve, that same dry, unhurried twist I had first heard in her voice in the Ram and Crown's yard. You had better call me Alice, since I understand that is the custom when a lady accepts. I believe I made some sound at that point, something between a laugh and a shout, entirely undignified for a gentleman of my standing, and Mrs. Tallow's needlework fell entirely forgotten into her lap, and my brother. The restless Duke, who had not smiled properly in front of me in perhaps 3 years, laughed aloud, an open, startled, boyish sound I had nearly forgotten he possessed, and crossed the small space between them, and took her hand, not with any grand flourish, but the way a man takes hold of something he has been afraid for a long time to want. I will spare you the particulars of what passed between them just then, beyond saying that it was tender and brief and entirely proper, conducted as it was under Mrs. Tallow's beaming supervision and my own delighted, useless witness, and that when my brother finally released her hand it was only to ask, with the particular gravity of a man already plotting logistics, how quickly a special license might be obtained, and whether the Ashworth family might be sent a very generous letter of apology, along with a recommendation of some other governess, equally deserving of a kinder household. The gossip did come, of course. Word travels a coaching road faster than any carriage, and within a fortnight half the drawing rooms of London had heard some version of the tale: a duke, a stray governess, a whirlwind courtship over 4 days of shared road. Some tellings were unkind, hinting at scheme on the lady's part, folly on the gentleman's. But I was there, and I can tell you plainly that no scheme could have produced what I watched grow across those 4 days, because no calculation explains a man falling in love with someone precisely, because she refused, at every turn, to let herself be managed. We were married inside the month, myself standing as my brother's groomsman in a small chapel near Kelsmore rather than the grand London affair our father would have insisted upon, for Ali's wanted nothing grand, and my brother, I think, wanted nothing his father would have approved of, which amounted to the same happy result. Mrs. Tallow wept through the whole ceremony and took full credit afterward for having chaperoned the match into respectability, which I did not dispute, since I believe she had rather earned the boast. Kelsmore itself changed within the year, in ways I could not have engineered if I had tried. My brother, who had spent a decade unable to walk its corridors without his shoulders going rigid, found himself, under Ali's calm management of the household, gradually willing to sit in rooms he had long avoided, to open shutters closed since our mother's day, to let the old restless habit of travel loosen its grip by slow degrees. Ali's ran that house with unshowy competence and a dry wit that had the staff laughing within a week and devoted within a month. And I noticed, on my visits, that my brother had begun to look less like a man escaping his own home and more like one who had finally discovered he wished to stay in it. She kept her old habit of noticing what others overlooked. It was Ali's who noticed the steward's daughter had a gift for figures and saw her properly educated for it. It was Ali's who noticed the Ashworth family's second governess, hired in her place, was being worked half to exhaustion, and quietly arranged a better post for her elsewhere, negotiated with a firmness that would have done a solicitor credit. My brother, for his part, learned to notice things too, learned that a woman who had spent 6 years being ordered about wanted, more than any grand gesture, simply to be asked, and so he asked her about everything, down to the naming of their first child, a daughter born some 14 months after that night at the Ram and Crown, whom they named, with a fondness I still find moving, Grace. I asked my brother once, some years on, sitting with him over brandy in a Kelsmore drawing-room that no longer felt like a mausoleum of our father's disappointments, whether he ever thought of that first night, lifting his lantern to find a stranger asleep in his carriage. "Every day," he said, without hesitation. "I think of how close I came to simply waking her, apologizing for the confusion, and sending her on to the next coach without another thought, the way I had sent 100 other strangers on their way in 100 other coaching yards. I think of how little it would have taken for me to miss her entirely." "You'd have found her eventually," I said. "You always were too stubborn a man to miss the one thing worth staying still for." He gave me a look I recognized well, the old dry look he had worn for most of our lives before that journey softened him, but there was warmth threaded all through it now that had not always been there before. "I have never in my life," he said, "been so grateful for a clerk's untidy ledger and an innkeeper who could not keep his coaches straight." "Nor Hobbes's terrible penmanship," I said. "We ought to send the man a case of good port." "We sent him 4, my brother said. Ali's insisted. She said a man who accidentally arranges the happiest accident of one's life deserves rather better than gratitude alone. I have thought of that often since, of how the whole of my brother's happiness turned upon so small and ordinary a mistake, a shared surname on a ledger, a porter pointing to the wrong coach, a tired woman falling asleep where she oughtn't. It is not the sort of story anyone would have designed on purpose, but I have come to believe the truest kind of love rarely announces itself with grand design. More often it arrives exhausted, half asleep, entirely by accident, and stays only because two stubborn, guarded people were, for once, brave enough to let it. I stood as godfather to young Grace the following spring, and I confess I wept rather more than the occasion strictly required, though I told my brother it was only the incense in the chapel, and he did not believe me, and did not press the matter, which I have come to understand is simply how he loves the people nearest him now, not with grand declarations, but with the quiet, steady attention of a man who once nearly missed the best thing in his life through simple inattention, and has spent every day since determined never to make that mistake again. As for Ali's, she tells the story herself now and then, at dinners, to guests who have heard some garbled version of it and want the truth from her own mouth, and she always ends it the same way, with that same dry twist to her mouth I first heard in a coaching yard 4 years ago now. "I only meant to catch the Bristol mail," she says. "I have never in my life been so glad of a wrong turn." And my brother, every single time, reaches across the table for her hand, without any fuss, without any grand gesture, the way a man reaches for a thing he has long since stopped being afraid to want, and says nothing at all, because by now, between the two of them, nothing at all is exactly enough. There is one more thing I ought to set down, since I have undertaken to tell this tale honestly and not merely fondly, and it concerns the autumn following their wedding, when the old scandal-tellers of London, having exhausted the coaching-yard story, tried once more to make trouble of it. A dowager of considerable spite, a Lady Pennyworth whose own daughter had once hoped to catch my brother's eye, took it upon herself to suggest at a card party that the entire mishap had been arranged between Ali's and some confederate porter, for the express purpose of trapping a title, and that decent society ought to be wary of governesses who fell so conveniently asleep in dukes' carriages. Word reached Kelsmore within the week, as such things always do, and I watched my brother's jaw go tight in the old dangerous way, the way it used to before Ali's had gentled some of the restlessness out of him, and I feared for a moment he meant to ride to London and settle the matter with a directness Lady Pennyworth would not have enjoyed. Ali stopped him with a hand on his arm before he had even called for his horse. "Let me answer it," she said. "I have spent 6 years being spoken of by people who never troubled to know me. I find I am rather better practiced at it than you are." She wrote Lady Pennyworth a letter herself, which I was permitted to read only because my brother, laughing, insisted I deserved to see it after everything I had witnessed. It was a masterpiece of icy civility, thanking the dowager for her concern regarding governesses and coaches, observing mildly that she was surprised so seasoned a hostess would credit a porter with the wit to arrange an engagement, since in her own experience porters could scarcely be trusted to arrange trunks correctly, let alone destinies, and closing with the hope that Lady Pennyworth's own daughter might soon find a match as happy as the one so uncharitably doubted, since happiness, in Ali's experience, tended to make women rather less inclined toward spite. The letter did its work. It was read aloud, with great relish, at no fewer than 3 drawing-rooms that my brother heard of directly, and Lady Pennyworth's card parties grew noticeably thinner for a season afterward, while Ali's standing, rather than suffering, only rose, for London society has always had a grudging respect for a woman who can dispatch a dowager without raising her voice. "You did not need my help at all," my brother said to her that evening, watching her fold the dowager's eventual, considerably chastened reply into the fire. "I never did," Ali said. "That was rather the point of insisting you let me answer it myself. I did not marry you to be defended, Marcus. I married you to be believed." "You are the only person alive who calls me that," he said, "and the only person alive I would let manage a quarrel on my behalf without feeling I had failed some duty of my own." "Then we are well matched," she said, "for I have spent my whole life managing quarrels no one else would trouble to fight for me, and I find I rather like having, at last, someone worth fighting them for." I set this down last because it completes the picture better than the wedding did, better even than that first lantern-lit moment in the coaching yard. It is one thing for a duke to rescue a stranger from a night's scandal. It is quite another to learn, over years of ordinary mornings, that the woman he married never needed rescuing at all. Only the overdue courtesy of being asked, and believed, and loved for exactly the clear-eyed, dignified creature she had been all along, long before any ledger, any porter, any lantern brought them together by so fortunate a mistake. I am an old man now as I write this down, older than my brother was that night at the Ram and Crown, and Kelsmore is full of grandchildren's noise these days, a sound the house never had in our own boyhood, and I confess I still cannot pass through a coaching inn yard, anywhere in England, without glancing toward whatever fine carriage stands waiting there, half expecting to see, through its window, some tired stranger asleep against the velvet cushions, dreaming of nothing at all, about to wake into the very last mistake she would ever need to make.